couple of things to get us started. First, it's important to recognize that the family systems field is a really broad, diverse field. There are a lot of different theories that work to explain what goes on within families and that give suggestions for what people need to do to resolve those concerns. A little bit like ice cream there. There are lots of different flavors of ice cream, but they're all ice cream. So as we talk today, we're going to really focus on the things that they have in common. Like ice cream, all ice cream flavors have sugar, have cream. We're going to focus on the things that these systems theories have in common. Then the second thing to keep in mind is that you can do family systems work even if you've only got one person in the room. It doesn't matter how many people there are in the room. This is a way of thinking about what causes and what's needed to resolve client concerns. I would say it's more helpful. It works better, maybe easier is a better word, when you've got more than one person in the room. But if you've only got one family member, you can still do family systems work. Just a little bit of background about the family systems approach. Typically, we trace the roots of the family systems approach back to Adler, who was the first to suggest that a client's context, the environment that the client is living in, plays a huge role both in development and in current functioning. And he also really emphasized the importance of the family unit. At the same time, there was quite a reaction against some of the individual psychology approaches. I think people were feeling like we've kind of reached the limit here with what we can do. It was mostly with things like psychodynamic and behaviorist approaches. People were looking for something new, a little frustrated with the idea that we're blaming individuals. Maybe individuals aren't to blame. Maybe it's a broader systems issue. At the same time, there was a real growth in what was called general systems theory. So different than family systems, but general systems theory looked at the way systems function together. So good examples in biology, when we talk about all of the different cells of an organism, the cells are individual and are unique. They're doing different things, but they work in concert with all the other cells so that the organism functions as a whole unit. It's a good example of a system. Ecology is another good example. We have to take into account the soil, the water, the plants, the animals. All these different elements function together to create an ecology. Then in 1952, a psychiatrist named Elderkin Bell traveled over to England to visit some folks at a famous psychiatric clinic over there called the Tavistock Clinic. And over there, the people were working with individuals who had schizophrenia, and Elderkin went over to see what they were doing to see if he could learn something from them. And in the course of their conversations, the people in England said, yeah, we've started working with the family. And nothing really more came of that. But on the way back home, Bell decided, I should probably start working with families. And so when he got back, he started bringing the whole family together. Now, that was a lucky mistake because the people in England were really just visiting with one member of the family at a time. They hadn't brought the whole families together. But that kind of started the ball rolling with seeing whole families together. And there was a group in California called the Palo Alto group that was also working to see what they could do to help people who were dealing with schizophrenia. And they started seeing whole families together and had quite a bit of success. It was pretty revolutionary. They would hospitalize whole families and work on helping the symptomatic person, the person with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, to resolve their concerns and to resolve the symptoms. And they were quite effective. At about the same time, a guy named Salvador Minuchin was working with some inner city families in New York City. These were multi-problem, multi-risk families who were struggling with some pretty severe challenges. And he also found quite a bit of success using a family systems approach. So those last 2 points are really to illustrate that family systems theory grew out of work with what we might consider pretty challenging clients, some severe mental illness, and families with multiple risks, multiple challenges. A couple of central concepts of systems theory. And a good place to start would be to figure out first what exactly is a system. So a system is a set of interrelated parts that somehow functions together as a unit. And another way of saying that is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So the relationship between the parts and the way they interact is what's key to it being a system instead of just a group of parts. So the car parts, you can look at all those different parts. You might know a lot about the individual parts, but that doesn't mean that you know how an engine works, or because to do that you have to understand what's the relationship between all these parts and how does it function together as a coherent unit. So say we had, like, there's that fan belt there. If you had a worn belt, you might notice, oh, there's a problem with this belt. But when you put it in the system and you looked at it in the system and you saw that there was another part that was rubbing on that belt and that's why it was worn, that would give you more information. So it's not just a problem with the belt itself, it's a problem with the system that's showing up as a problem in the belt. And that's one of the key ideas in systems theory, is that you have to understand how all these parts work together to really get a sense of what's going on with people. So the next thing to remember about systems is that their functioning has a purpose. Typically, there is some sort of goal that the system is striving to achieve. Now, often these are unwritten goals, often even unspoken. But for instance, if the family has this pattern of always suppressing anger, then a lot of their behavior might be based on pursuing that goal to kind of keep anger to a minimum. So the point being that their behavior is not random, that the system functioning is determined by a goal. And when we can understand what those goals are, the relationship among the different parts, the people in the family, makes greater sense. A couple of examples. So think about someone doing the wave in the stadium. Now, if it was just one person by herself and she just all of a sudden stood up, raised her arms over her head and screamed, we might think that the person had a serious problem. But when when you see the whole pattern, the whole context, when you see the broader system, the pattern emerges and it starts to make sense. And even more so when you understand the goal, that this is a fun thing, that people feel part of the crowd, that it's a way to let off some steam, to have fun. So it looks crazy when it's just a solo behavior. Put it in context, understand the goal, and it makes more sense. Here's an advertisement from a couple of years ago that I think also illustrates this point.
We are. Got it.
Another thing to know about systems is that they are multi-layered and embedded within other systems. So there are subsystems within families. You might consider each individual to be a subsystem of the family system. Then there are groups or coalitions within the family. So there could be a parent subsystem or a sibling subsystem. There could be a boy subsystem, a girl subsystem. So lots of smaller systems within the family unit. At the same time, there are also suprasystems. So the family unit is part of an extended family, is part of a neighborhood, maybe part of a church group, other community groups, or the nation, and eventually the broader culture. So it's a little bit like an onion. You can start at one point and you can go narrower and you can go broader. Another important point to note about family systems is that they strive to maintain what's called a homeostatic balance. Once they establish a way of being, they try to preserve that. And when something disturbs the system, it will try to come back and settle into that homeostatic balance. A little bit like the mobile there. If we were to go up and just push on one of those elements, the whole thing would kind of shift and move around, and then eventually it would settle right back into its same balance. So that's what family systems often do. There's this drive towards balance. And then finally, something to note is that the bigger a system is, the more complex it is, the more relationships there are between parts. Think of it, the difference between a small, I don't know, multi-celled organism, microscopic, multiple cells. It's a system, but doesn't compare at all to a human being and the thousands, millions of cells within us. So bigger systems are more complex, a little more challenging to shift and to change. Another important dimension of family systems are what we call system rules. And these are different than the rules that a family sits down and agrees upon and writes down and posts on the fridge about no hitting and wash your hands before dinner. Instead, a family's system rules are kind of the unwritten procedures that they use for guiding how they function together. These are the rules that define the roles of different people within the family, how they operate, and they become important about things like expression of emotions, showing love, showing approval, discipline, how the family deals with change and stress. Those kinds of things become kind of regular patterned ways of being, and they're really important to understanding what causes problems and then to how we resolve problems. So it's important to understand these. Also, it notes down there that most system rules are not linear. It's not, well, if John does X, then Bill does Y. Instead, they're circular. They loop back around, and it's hard to know what started what. Sometimes in family therapy, we'll talk about circular causality, the idea that you don't know where something really began, what caused it, a specific symptom, because it could begin at a lot of different points and it loops back on itself. So here's an example taken from like a classroom. Suppose the teacher scolds Carol for being kind of clingy and needy. And so Carol kind of withdraws. She's upset and sad. But over time, the teacher kind of tries to go back and pull her back in, reaches out, goes over, comforts her. And Carol kind of comes back into the group, but then slowly over time starts getting needy again, clingy. And then eventually the teacher gets tired of that and scolds Carol for being clingy. So Carol withdraws. So it's a cycle that just repeats itself. And while I've written it out here as starting with teacher scolding Carol, we really don't know where that pattern began. So you can't blame really the teacher or Carol for it. It's just a pattern that the two of them are involved in. So what I'd like you to do for class tomorrow is to take a minute and jot down what do you think are one or two of the rules, these circular patterns of interacting that were important in your family system growing up. So don't do something too intense. Make it something that you can share in class, but try to look for a pattern of behavior around something like expression of emotion or the way your family dealt with something. And bring those in so we can have some examples in class tomorrow of your family rules. Now we're ready to talk about what family systems theory says is at the root of client concerns. And it would be the same for an individual or a whole family. The root of the concerns is the same. And essentially, the theory says that when a family fails to adapt the patterns of interaction, those rules and roles, the way they deal with each other and with the world, when it fails to adapt those in response to either external pressure or internal development, then mental health concerns will arise. Now, external pressures are things like someone losing a job or a change in the economy, a change in the neighborhood, could be moving to a new city or town. Those kinds of external pressures force the family to have to interact in new ways. Internal development also forces the family to interact in new ways. When a baby is born, when a family member dies, as children get older or as the parents get older, all those things require that the people in the family interact in new ways. They need to develop new patterns, new rules, new roles. When they fail to do so, mental health concerns will come up. So three things happen when those external pressures or internal development pressures happen. The family can either fall apart, fragment. What's more common is that one or more members of the family will develop some symptoms. And I think that's what we're seeing happen with Opie. He's getting older, he's needing new freedoms, new responsibilities, he's exploring new things, but Andy isn't really treating him at that level. He continues to treat him as a young child. The town is changing a little bit. The family is not responding well, not changing, adapting to those changes, and so Opie's developing some symptoms. And then the third alternative is what we hope happens. It's what happens with healthy families. The family adjusts its way of being, its way of interacting with each other, and they find a new balance. For assessment in the family systems approach, the biggest issue is that there's less of a focus on why, trying to understand why something is happening, and instead they try to just focus on understanding what is going on. And this comes back to the notion of circular causality. Since those cyclical patterns or rules, you can't decide what started first, so there's no need to try and understand why or who's responsible or how it got started. Instead, you just try to really understand what is the pattern. Now, there might be a little bit trying to figure out what forces have caused the system to become unstable. Was it the birth of a child? Was it a child experimenting with drugs or with sexuality or something like that jolted the system so that the old patterns were no longer effective? That can be helpful to understand sometimes, but there's no sense of trying to understand who caused the current pattern to be problematic. There's very little blame. It's just, hey, this is no longer working. Here's exactly what is going on, and let's see how we can understand that. So again, we're just trying to identify the rules and the roles. What are the patterns of interaction, and how do those patterns impact both the family as a whole as well as each individual member? The family might look great on the outside, but if individual members are suffering, are not getting their needs met, are not able to develop, are unhappy, then the pattern isn't healthy. So you have to look at both the family as well as the individual members. You do all of this through a lot of observation, through interacting with the family, trying to get a sense of how do they respond, how do they interact with each other. When you get multiple members of a family together, you can observe a lot of this. And then the final thing there is with some circular questioning. So this would be asking questions to different members of the family about other members. So I might ask the mom, tell me, what is it that your husband does when your daughter acts up? So getting people to report about each other's functioning sometimes helps to see who's doing what, and they can provide a different perspective than the actual people who are involved in the pattern. And the final point to make there is that assessment is not a separate activity from intervention. They're often occurring simultaneously. As I'm learning about the system, I'm going to start trying to create change within the system. And that's what we'll talk about next. All right, so let's talk about the doing part of this theory. We've talked about the knowing, what causes problems, what's needed to resolve problems. Talked a little bit about assessment, so what do we actually do with families? So first of all, the goal here is to change the system. We talked about how altering the family rules, roles, and patterns is going to be what resolves the concerns. The problems are from faulty patterns of interaction, problematic family rules, so those are the things that we need to change. And this is true even if you're working with just one person. If I'm working from a family systems perspective, I'm going to help that individual to change the way he or she responds to other family members in the system. And the reason why that works is that change anywhere within the system will invite a response throughout the system. So think again of the woman there who's adjusting the mobile. If she moves one element in that system, everything else is going to have to shift to find a new balance. So that's why it works with just one person. If you can get one person to make a change in the patterns, then there's going to be a broader systemic change. So when you do get a change somewhere in the system, three things are likely to happen. First of all, you're going to get what's called homeostatic pressure. Family systems don't like to change very much. This is true of broader systems as well. As a nation, we don't like rapid change. Businesses, school settings, we don't like a lot of quick change. So we try to make things go back the way they were. So when an individual in a family system makes a change, the other family members, usually it's unconscious, they will try to get that member to go back to functioning within the roles and the rules that were already established. A second thing that happens is often new symptoms will emerge. We talked about that on a previous slide, how when there's a change somewhere in the system either falls apart, symptoms emerge, or they shift to a new healthy way of functioning. And that's the third thing that can happen here. So we're going to invite some changes and try to help it move towards a systemic restructuring, an altering of the family rules and roles, patterns of interaction that will eliminate any symptoms and will allow for healthy functioning for all of the family members. And that's the point there at the bottom, that when we can get the system to change, the symptoms, the problems that brought the clients in will typically disappear. Some of the kinds of systemic change that a counselor will work with the family on producing revolve around three kind of big things. First of all, there's a lot of work with altering the rules and the patterns related to communication, not just what is said, but how things are communicated. And it goes beyond just verbal communication as well. It will include all the nonverbals. Even silence communicates a powerful message. So helping the family become aware of and change the way that they communicate with each other, as well as taking a look at the kinds of things that are being communicated. Secondly, a counselor can work to help alter the patterns related to problem resolution and how the family negotiates different things that they're working on. That can be an important thing to work on. And then finally, helping alter the rules and the patterns related to how this family makes meaning. What does it mean to be a member of this family, and what do we as a family value? Those things need to shift over time as well, and so making that explicit and helping the family alter those patterns and rules can be important as well. Let's wrap up then with a little more about some specific interventions and then a few words on the counselor's way of being in the family systems approach. As I mentioned way back at the beginning, there are a lot of different family therapy approaches. And so there's a wide range of techniques, and I'm going to focus on just some of the more common ones that seem to get used in a lot of the different approaches. In general, the techniques tend to be a little gestaltish, and by that I mean that there's a real focus on here and now enactment. It's not that we want to talk about changes, although we'll do that. We're going to try and create change right within the session. Try to alter the patterns of interaction, the way the family does things together right in the session as we're together. And they do this with a variety of things. Very common thing to do is a genogram, which is kind of a visual representation of the family and the relationships. And then you have conversations about how to alter them, how to do things differently, and you start trying to pull that right into session. An ecomap is an extension of a genogram, and it also takes a look at some of the suprasystems, some of the broader systems that might be influencing the family and playing a role in the family's concerns. I'll show you an example of both of those in just a second. Family sculpture is where you create a visual representation of the interaction patterns using the family members to sculpt. We'll do one of those, I think, in class tomorrow. And then a lot of role plays. So if the family has difficulty managing, say, difficult emotions or challenging emotions, then in session the counselor might invite the family to actually process, to deal with some difficult emotion, or to deal with difficult subjects in healthier ways, so that in session, in vivo enactment to resolve things. Let's take a look here at a genogram. So in the middle of the big circle is the genogram, and you can see the different family members. The person in red, she would be the wife, is considered the identified client. She's the one with the symptoms, and so she's in the center of the genogram. And all the different family members are listed out there. Now there's some symbols that indicate the directional flow of energy. There's ways to indicate conflict. So there's a whole convention about what symbols you use to represent different relationship patterns. And I'll give you a handout related to those, but you can see that's kind of all mapped out there. And then on the outside, the smaller circles represent other systems that are influencing the family. If I were doing this, I might use the size of those to represent how strong they are. I might put them at farther distance or closer to the family to indicate part of the relationship that they're having with the family. But an eco map is another way that you can help families become aware of and start to change the interaction patterns. A little bit about presence then. The family therapist, the family counselor is very dynamic, is actively engaged. There's no sitting back. You're working to involve all of the family members who are present, and you do that by connecting with each of them. So if I've got 4 or 5 family members, I need to make sure that I regularly connect with and maintain the connection with each of them. Get each of them involved in what's going on. I will also strategically use my power as the counselor. So I'm playing kind of a central role and maybe directing the drama that's unfolding. And so I might sit close to someone who seems to have little power, or if there's a family member who seems to have too much power, I might sit close to them to be able to kind of quiet them down. I might stop them from interrupting or hold them back. So using your body position, your tone of voice, and the things that you do to alter the pattern of interaction in the family. I love family therapy. It's a lot of fun. It's challenging, but it's a lot of fun. And look forward to our conversation tomorrow.